do today, which is called the Phillips curve, is gonna seem kind of difficult, but it really isn't, okay? And I'm gonna do my best to try to make sure that I explain this in terms of like real world examples, etc. So that when you get a question about the Phillips curve, and you will, I've never not seen it on a macro exam, you will be able to answer it, okay? But a lot of the things that we're gonna start with, the fiscal and monetary policy actions in the short run, this is a review. None of this is gonna be new information, it's just kind of a new way of thinking about it and kind of putting it all together now that we've done all the things with monetary and fiscal policy, okay? So that's what we're gonna do today, and then we'll move on to the Phillips curve, which again is not that hard, okay? And then a lot of this other stuff is reiterating what crowding out is about, looking at government deficits and the national debt, trying to figure out something that's called the velocity of money, okay? And a lot of this is about, okay, are we outrunning our policy decisions, okay? So like the big idea of this unit is we have now studied fiscal and monetary policy, which are ways that the government can try to help to correct for inflationary or recessionary gaps and try to steer us as calmly and stably through a business cycle as possible, okay? But there are some short and long run consequences of those policies. And so what we're going to be looking at is, are these policies creating additional problems we're going to have to fix in the future? Or are they getting at the things that we want them to get to? And you know, a lot of economists are going to say, like, as long as we're kind of quote unquote outrunning the bigger problems, it's okay to accept the short run problems, okay? So remember yesterday in the video with Mr. Clifford and the other lady whose name I can never remember, they were talking about all the different schools of thoughts, right? Where they were kind of going through the neoclassicists, you know, the monetarists, the Keynesians, and all that kind of stuff. We've sort of, not quite yet, totally, but sort of arrived on this kind of like middle ground consensus among most macro economists. Like, they'll disagree about some of the finer nuances of things, but we're almost at kind of like a consensus view of like, yeah, let's do these things, and we just have to make sure that we take care of these other problems along the way so that we're not getting behind the curve of our solutions consequences. Does that make sense? Maybe not yet, but it will. Okay. So we're going to start with 5.1 and 5.2, and I think we should be able to get through it relatively quickly. Okay. All right. This is a discussion starter, and frankly, it's something that we've discussed in this class many, many times already, right? We've talked about the fact that the government utilized both fiscal and monetary policy to address the problems that arose out of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And the government spent nearly $3 trillion to reduce the federal funds rate. The government spent nearly $3 trillion, both to households and to firms, to try to help keep them afloat while the pandemic lockdown was occurring and while business was slow. They provided basically loans that were never paid back to firms so that they could keep employees on their payrolls. They gave extra sort of tax credit monies to families, kind of these like tax rebate checks, if you will, to promote spending. And the idea was like, okay, the government wants to try to keep everybody spending, to keep people employed so that they'll continue to spend so that we don't end up in a depression, okay? So that that we do okay. And it, for the most part, worked, okay? It definitely worked. It's had consequences, not all of them positive, but it did work, okay? At the same time that the federal government was doing that, the Federal Reserve Bank reduced the target rate or the policy rate to almost, well, they did reduce it to 0, okay? So the interest rate for banks to loan each other money, as well as what they were giving for excess reserves, was equal to 0, okay? But we have seen in the short run, at the time of this book's publishing, that the inflation rate reached 6.8%. Actually, it got as high as 8%, but that was after this book was, the version of this book that was published. And it has only started coming down in the last year, okay? We're currently at an inflation rate of about 3.5%, which is still a percentage point and a half above the target inflation rate of 2%, okay? So it has had some consequences. So we're gonna look at what the consequences are of stabilization policies, and like kind of evaluate what else should the government be doing to mitigate the short-term implications and consequences of these stabilization policies, if anything, okay? So we're gonna look at the combined impact of both fiscal and monetary policies together, okay? So when all sort of steam ahead, engines firing on expansionary or contractionary policies, what does that look like? We're gonna talk about how that can restore full employment, which we absolutely have done since the spring of 2020. We'll look at how this looks on the macroeconomic equilibrium graph, and then we'll just kind of evaluate. But again, this is all going to be review, or at least it should be, okay? So obviously monetary policy refers to the actions of the central bank. That is changing the money supply, changing the discount rate, changing the policy rate, changing reserve requirements. Those are the tools of monetary policy. And those are executed by the central banks all over the world, and in the United States by the Fed, okay? In some countries, central banks are independent of the elected government, and that is true for the United States, for the most part. I won't say that the Fed chair and the governors of the Fed are completely immune to political pressures, but they do not require a constituency to be elected, right? They are nominated by the president, and then they serve terms of 12 years, and that's supposed to keep them above the election cycle fray, right? And we've had lots and lots of instances where the chair of the Fed was nominated by a president from one political party, and he or she was doing such a great job that even though the next president was from a different political party, they decided to keep them on, right? So, for example, a great example of this is Alan Greenspan in the 1990s. Alan Greenspan was nominated by President George Bush I, but Clinton was a fan, thought that he was doing a great job, and Clinton kept him on to, generally speaking, really great success, okay? And then the same with Ben Bernanke, who came afterwards, who was George Bush II, and Obama kept him on, although then later on it was Janet Yellen was appointed by Obama after Bernanke's term was over. And then after that, when Trump became president, he got rid of Janet Yellen because I think he just wanted to get rid of everything that Obama did, and appointed Jerome Powell. And Jerome Powell is still our chair. So even though he was a Trump appointee, again, Biden has been a fan, and he's been a good steward of our economy, so he's been kept on, okay? All right. Now, the government, meaning our Congress and our executive branch, what they generally do is adjust their fiscal policies depending on what's going on with the Fed. The Fed and the central banks generally can respond to changes in the business cycle much more quickly than our Congress and our executive branch can, okay? They are much less bound by those time lags, okay? They also have a whole army of economists who are very smart people who are looking into all these different aspects of the economy and making, really good predictions based on their models, their mathematical models. And so they're in it all the time. It's their only job: full employment, economic growth, price stability, right? So that being said, what happens when all engines are firing? Okay. So let's first talk about expansionary policies, okay? For both fiscal policy and monetary policy, these are, when they are expansionary, the idea is to target increasing aggregate demand for households and firms to have more disposable income to spend, right? And also to provide a lower interest rate that makes it cheaper for firms to borrow money and to conduct investment spending, okay? I really want to focus right here on investment spending, because investment spending is typically increasing our country's physical and sometimes human capital. Okay, and the reason why I'm bringing this up now is you're going to earmark that for later, because when we start talking about long-run economic growth, not just short-run stimulus of aggregate demand, this is definitely more important than short-run increases in aggregate demand, okay? Because that durable physical capital and those investments in our human resources are going to outlast the short-run impacts of changes in aggregate demand, okay? But anyway, when they're expansionary, right, they have the same impact. We get more consumer spending via the multiplier. And you might be asking yourself, how does higher investment spending lead to higher consumer spending? When firms are conducting more investment spending, they're hiring more workers, right? And those people are making better salaries. There's less unemployment, and that means that people are buying more stuff. Does that make sense? Okay. So essentially, it can boost the economy out of a recessionary gap, and that's what it looks like graphically. And the downside in the short run is that we get that back to our potential output, but we do get some inflation, okay? And we're only evaluating changes in aggregate demand right now. Sometimes some of this can lead to increases in short-run aggregate supply as well. We'll handle that later, which can then bring prices down a little bit. But for now, we're just going to say in the short run, there is generally kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Not an opportunity cost, a trade-off, that's it. A trade-off between unemployment and inflation, right? If we want higher levels of employment or lower levels of unemployment, that is usually at the expense of there being some inflation or higher inflation than there was before, okay? And then we'll look at how the reverse of that is true as well. So here, that higher consumer spending leads to an increase in aggregate demand. Shifting it to the right, we get higher levels of output. We're back at potential output, albeit at a higher price level. Okay, the reverse is true as well. So when we look at tight monetary policy or contractionary fiscal and monetary policy, these are policies that are put into place in order to deal with a inflationary gap. And by the way, this is what is happening With monetary policy, right now, the Fed is definitely they have been raising the interest rate throughout 2023. They've kept it the same right now, okay? And that does have the impact of decreasing consumer spending, decreasing investment spending, and trying to pull back aggregate demand, okay? I want you guys to understand from a policy perspective that it is much easier for the Fed to engage with contractionary monetary policy than it is for Congress and the executive branch to conduct contractionary fiscal policy. Does anybody want to take a stab at why that might be? Think about what fiscal policy is: increasing or decreasing government spending, increasing or decreasing taxes. Why would it be harder to do contractionary fiscal policy?
Because people would get mad if like taxes were increased.
Nobody likes to pay more taxes, including liberals, and because that's money that you feel like you've earned, and the government's coming to take it away, right? So, oh, your taxes are going to go up? Like, no, thank you. Okay. Firms don't like it because then that means that their profits have decreased. They're going to decrease. Okay. And people get used to, if their transfer payments have increased or there's been more government spending, government sponsored jobs, for example, it's not like that. And then you might worry like, oh, I might lose my job, or I might lose my SNAP benefits or my housing subsidy or whatever. Those things are harder for Congress to manage politically. This doesn't have anything to do with economics. This is politics. Because when you give something to someone, it is much more difficult to take it away. Does that make sense to you guys? So we've had tax decreases in the last 4 years. And if Congress, committed themselves to increasing taxes over the next few years, I have a feeling that many of those folks would be voted out of office, right? And they have a lot of pressure to stay in office. So we definitely see more contractionary policy from central banks than we do from our fiscal leaders in Congress and the executive branch. But it looks like this, and you guys have seen this before. This is a review, right? If there's an inflationary gap, both of those two things together would reduce aggregate demand. We would be back at potential output, and we would bring prices back under control, right? Or bring the price level down to an inflation level that was acceptable. Okay, does that all make sense to you guys? Okay, great. Okay. So these are the impacts of fiscal and monetary policies on the economy in the short run, okay? What we really want to get to is how these things impact our long run picture, especially as it relates to potential output. Like, what impact is this going to have on our long run aggregate supply curve? And so the remainder of this unit is going to focus on that. And we'll also evaluate, okay, if we always get back to zero, if we always get back to that potential output, should the government really be doing anything anyway, right? I think there's a compelling argument to be made that they should, but I think a counter argument could be that, well, it should be very targeted to make sure that it impacts certain groups of people, because not every group of households or firms in this country is the same, right? And different groups of people have different marginal propensities to consume and to save, and firms display different behavior when their taxes and regulations and things like that are being targeted. So we're going to evaluate all those with more specificity. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, you guys are dragging backside. Get up and walk around, okay? Need you guys to